Before we start, we'd like to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Viewers follow this channel from across the world. January 20th, 1953, 8:45 a.m. The White House. A weathered brass thermometer on the north portico read 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the needle reluctant and stubborn as a man who had been waiting too long. The wind off the Potomac had the low, clean cruelty of a butcher's blade, and it cut at the elm branches that lined the driveway until they rattled like dry bones. From inside the Oval Office, Harry S. Truman watched through the wide glass as though the single act of watching might shift something fundamental. A closed door might open, a conversation might be had, a final wall might not have to be raised. Truman's hands were clasped behind his back in that old stance he took for important thoughts, a farmer's posture of restraint and readiness. He had not slept properly since 5:30, not because of excitement or relief, but because the morning thudded against him like a drumbeat he could not stop. He had arranged the little things that signaled civility, the pot of Truman's particular coffee, dark, bitter, with enough sugar for someone who liked to be pragmatic about small comforts, the modest tray of rye toast and preserves in the blue room, a half-hour carved clean in the morning for 2 old soldiers, as he had told aides. 30 minutes, long enough to be private, short enough to be ceremonial, long enough to hand over the map, the files, the little mercies of administration. Outside, a black limousine idled like an accusation. Its engine hummed, its tailpipe breathed out a silver fog that disappeared into the hard air. Inside that car sat Dwight David Eisenhower. The man's profile was a familiar framed photograph, wide forehead, heavy jaw, the soft hollows by his mouth that suggested both a smile and a habitual restraint. He was the general who had been given legions, who had ordered convoys across the ruined continent and kept the lights of coalition burning. To Truman, he was, at once, the soldier he had admired and the man who had, in public ways and private choices, become an enigma. People often reduce moments like this to a single gesture, the slammed door, the raised eyebrow, the single closure that defines a relationship's fate. But history, like politics, is rarely contained in a single gesture. It circles, it returns, it builds pressure in quiet, almost private increments. An edit cut from a speech here, a bitter remark in a hotel corridor there, the slow accrual of distrust. On this morning, those small fractures had become a single visible fissure. The limousine door remained closed. Minutes passed and turned into a small ceremonial torture. 8:46, 8:47, 8:48. White House ushers, men in crisp coats whose job was to make pageantry seamless, shuffled and looked at one another. The head usher, Joseph B. West, stood nearby with a face like a man attending a wedding where the bride had not shone. He had seen transitions before. He had seen grief and triumph and the small domestic weirdnesses of handing over the most powerful office in the world. He had read the protocol manuals, the memos, the paragraphs that prescribed ritual. He had never seen such a thing as this, the incoming president refusing to take 5 minutes of civility while his predecessor waited with coffee and a cordial hand. On the North Lawn, reporters formed a ring the way gulls gather over a tossed sandwich. Not aggressive, more curious than anything. NBC and CBS men shifted their cameras, adjusting for light and frost. Eric Severide stood with others and watched the car like a person caught trying to decide whether to say goodbye. He saw Secret Service agents move from foot to foot, their faces blank, the faces of men whose training prepared them for everything but ceremonial rebuke. Photographers hovered near the portico, fingers poised. They could sense that a photograph taken now would have the kind of clarity that endured, an image that would be printed in newspapers and discussed in living rooms and argued about in the months to come. Truman could have left the room and gone to the car.
He could have knocked on the window and demanded entry. He could have made a noise, an old president's roar, that forced a reaction. Instead, he stayed by the window and watched. That motion said more than 1,000 words. It was as if the man who had made the atomic decision, who had run a war administration, who had kept the nation's ships and aircraft in motion and the machinery of state working, could not quite accept the new scale of personal betrayal he felt. There was an old story, or rather, a memory, that haunted both men. It went back to a hot Autobahn outside Frankfurt in July of 1945. The war in Europe had been decided. The rubble still smoked, and the smell of combusted timber lingered in places the eye did not want to find. Truman had arrived in Germany with the bluntness of a man who had been called to assume enormous responsibility after the sudden death of another.
He had not sought the office, but he had taken it with a farmer's steady hand. Eisenhower had offered to walk. The Autobahn, that vast slab of concrete running through leveled towns, had the muted majesty of something built for utility and vision. Truman admired it, the way a man admires the possibility of order. Broad lanes, clean engineering, something meant to help a nation move forward. On that stretch of concrete, Truman had said something to Eisenhower that a president rarely said so explicitly. "General, there is nothing you may want that I will not try to help you get." Speaking as a man who had learned to measure loyalty by the weight of promises, Truman meant the words. He had been serious in a way that surprised his military companion. He had been willing, he had said, to step aside in 1948, to be vice president again for the sake of the nation, if Eisenhower would agree to run on the Democratic ticket. It was not flattery. It was a strategic offer built of old alliances and a stark reading of national need. Eisenhower had demurred. He said he was a soldier, not a politician. He would not weaponize his uniform. He would not let the office be the spoils of a wartime reputation. It would be unfair to say Eisenhower's later decision to run as a Republican was a single betrayal, or that Truman's injuries were only about raw political partisanship. What hurt Truman, and what he said later, with the sort of direct contempt that could sound almost vulgar in public, was the impression of abandonment. George Marshall had been more than a general to Eisenhower. He was the man who had recognized his capacity and thrown the doors open. Marshall's quiet, steady eye had propelled Eisenhower from a staff officer to the commander of a coalition. Marshall's role in Eisenhower's life was not incidental. When McCarthy began his theatrics, when names were waved like talismans to inspire popular panic, the man most under attack was George Marshall, impresario of the Marshall Plan, architect of American military reorganization, a man whose life had been a sustained form of national service.
Eisenhower's silence in Milwaukee in October 1952, the deletion of a paragraph that would have defended Marshall, was not a single act of cowardice. It was, as many have argued since, a moment of calculation in which multiple stakes were weighed. Standing in Wisconsin, where McCarthy's local influence carried votes like currency, Eisenhower's team argued that an explicit defense of Marshall would split the party and jeopardize the chance to defeat the Democrats. Sherman Adams and other aides argued, as many political strategists would later argue, that the victories that make reforms possible are often muddy. One must win before one can insist on purity. Eisenhower, who had spent his life on the calculus of coalition, who had kept allies in line while the war's machinery moved, agreed. He crossed 60 or so words from a speech that, in the end, meant representing himself as a unifier rather than a polarizer. The image of Eisenhower on stage with McCarthy, grinning, shaking hands, accepting applause, became a photograph that did damage. For Truman, it was a sign that the man he had promoted, praised, and publicly urged to take the highest office had chosen power over principle. For Eisenhower's critics, it was evidence that political success required compromise. For Truman, it was that the scale of compromise had a moral dimension. Between the Autobahn's promise and the portico's frosty silence lies 1,000 small decisions. There were private letters, friendly dinners, formal ceremonies where two men had shared a stage and a handshake. There were also televised moments when the camera did what cameras do: magnify, simplify, create icons out of gestures. In the months leading to the January inauguration, conversations had hardened into rhetorical weapons. Truman, who could be blunt as a plowshare, used words against Eisenhower that pierced. "He's a coward," he said publicly. "He ought to be ashamed." Words that land as harsh political critique can transmute into personal injury when they reference a life built from loyalty and public service. Eisenhower, who had spent his life on the calculus of coalition, who had kept allies in line while the war's machinery moved, took those lines personally. Perhaps that is the simplest truth of all. Two men who had done enormous things together, each had wronged the other in ways that felt fundamental to themselves. Eisenhower saw Truman's campaign attacks as a kind of ignoble repayment for his service. Truman saw Eisenhower's political decisions as a betrayal of gratitude and of a mentor. Neither could, at first, take the measure of the other's pain. Instead, both hardened. So the limousine's door stayed shut.
Truman did not storm out in melodrama. He did the small, human thing that had always defined him. He walked down the steps to the car, buttoned his overcoat, and climbed into the back seat. For 12 minutes they would ride to the Capitol in a silence that suggested the length of a winter. When you measure that ride on the map, it is 12 minutes of geography. When you measure it in a life, it is 12 minutes of a rupture made permanent. They reached the Capitol, and Chief Justice Fred Vinson raised his hand and administered the oath. Eisenhower's voice rang out with a little of the formal cadence of a soldier and a little of a man practicing words that would have to serve as policy and comfort. He promised to lead the free world, to guard liberty, to offer stewardship. The crowd applauded, bands played, and there were the ritual tears and flags one expects of inaugurations. Truman walked to Union Station after the ceremony amid chanting thousands who, for reasons of loyalty and affection or habit, wanted to cheer the man who had weathered the war to bear the country through its nuclear moment. He boarded a train to return to Missouri and the private rhythms of a farmer's life. He left behind a capital that would be governed by the man who would refuse him more than a single cup of coffee at the portico. After that day, the silence became its own institution. For 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency, the former president did not receive a traditional call from the new man to come back, to advise, to lend the gentle gravitas of someone who had held the office. They met at funerals, the only places where protocol and mourning forced them into the same room. They were there once for Marshall's funeral, where both men sat in silence like two old statues. They were there for Sam Rayburn's memorial. They sat at John F. Kennedy's funeral procession decades later, and finally, after a national grief as raw as any that had confronted the nation, they broke the long rule of silence and sat for a long coffee in Blair House, talking about other dead men and the ways a presidency marks and is marked by time. That coffee after the assassination was not a reconciliation so much as a tentative truce. It was a moment in which two veterans of the same work spoke as colleagues and as men who had broken one another's solitude. They never fully repaired the rupture. In their memoirs, they wrote carefully, thinly about one another. But in that hour, in 1963, they wiped clean, if only briefly, a ledger that had been heavy with petty injuries and large wounds.
History will always debate culpability. Did Eisenhower owe a loyalty greater than his political coalition? Did Truman forfeit the high road by pointing his rhetorical gun at a man who had given enormous service? The answers are not clean because human beings are not clean. The two men each gave and each took. They each had been indispensable to the other's life and career. They each had suffered and each had inflicted suffering. Their story is not merely about policy or party. It is about pride and the small, fatal daily choices that let pride calcify into scorn. On a morning when frost stiffened the sap in North Lawn trees and steam rose off tailpipes like breath from a man in mourning, a car door remained closed. It was an ordinary thing, and in that ordinariness, it was definitive, a symbol of how a nation's rituals, which depend on small acts of civility, are always vulnerable to the private debts men owe one another. History kept the image, the idling limousine, the man at the window with his hands folded like a farmer's grip, the silence that filled a 12-minute ride. It was an episode to teach a lesson in leadership as much as memory. The public life of a country is stitched together by countless private courtesies. Lose those courtesies, and you risk unraveling much of what holds civic order. The story does not end at the portico. It loops back to the highway in Germany, to the apron of an auditorium in Wisconsin, to the offices and cables and small compromises that define political life. It ends as a cautionary tale. Great men, even those who once carried the world's burdens, can be felled by the ordinary human engines of resentment, expedience, and wounded loyalty. The American Republic survived the winter wind and the slamming door. It endured 2 presidencies that shaped the mid-century world. But the personal cost, a friendship lost, a silence that became custom, remained a winter that neither man fully thawed until changed by later grief and time. By early 1950, American political life was no longer dominated by the post-war optimism that had carried the nation through 1945 to 1948. Instead, fear, specifically fear of communist infiltration, was rising rapidly as a central political force. Several major international and domestic events intensified this fear, creating the climate in which Senator Joseph R. McCarthy would thrive. 2 events were particularly important. First, the Soviet Union's successful detonation of an atomic bomb in August 1949 shocked American intelligence and political leaders. The first successful U.S. atomic test had taken place in July 1945, and most estimates predicted the Soviet Union would require at least another 5 years to replicate the technology. The fact that Stalin had acquired nuclear capability far earlier than expected raised immediate concerns about espionage. Those concerns were later confirmed when Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, confessed to passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Second, Mao Zedong's Communist Party achieved victory in the Chinese Civil War in October 1949. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. China, the most populous nation in the world, had become communist. Many Republicans blamed the Truman administration, especially the State Department, for what they labeled the loss of China. This accusation would later form a major part of Joseph McCarthy's rhetoric. In this atmosphere of fear and blame, McCarthy found a receptive audience. McCarthy's Wheeling speech, February 9, 1950. On February 9, 1950, McCarthy delivered what became the defining speech of his career at the Women's Republican Club of Wheeling, West Virginia. The speech was not recorded, and multiple versions exist, but the most widely reported account came from the Wheeling Intelligencer the next morning. According to that report, McCarthy held up a piece of paper and declared, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names, a list of communists and fellow travelers who were still working and shaping policy in the State Department." The number, 205, would change repeatedly in the following days. McCarthy offered no consistent documentation. Nevertheless, the speech received immediate national attention. Headlines across the country echoed the accusation. McCarthy's list has been debated ever since. Later investigations showed that McCarthy had no such verified list and that his numbers were based on older, unrelated reports, not evidence of communist agents. But the public impact was dramatic. Telegrams and letters arrived in his office in unprecedented volume. Conservative newspapers praised him as the truth teller. Even many moderate Americans, unsettled by China and the Soviet bomb, were ready to believe that traitors existed at high levels of government.
The Truman administration dismissed the accusations as baseless, but denunciations from the White House only amplified McCarthy's national platform. George C. Marshall as a target. George C. Marshall, retired from the Army and serving in several senior civilian posts, became a central figure in McCarthy's narrative. In 1951, Marshall was serving as Secretary of Defense, having previously served as Secretary of State. His reputation during World War II and the immediate post-war years had been that of one of the most respected military leaders in American history. McCarthy's attack on Marshall culminated in an extended speech delivered on June 14, 1951, on the Senate floor. The speech ran more than 60,000 words and lasted approximately 3 hours, the longest major McCarthy address on record. In that speech, later published as America's Retreat from Victory, the story of George Catlett Marshall, McCarthy alleged that Marshall had been involved in a series of policies that benefited communist expansion, including allowing China to fall to communism, supposedly restraining anti-communist forces in post-war Europe, allegedly influencing decisions in a way that aided Soviet objectives. McCarthy never explicitly called Marshall a traitor, but the implication of conspiracy was unmistakable. The core argument was that Marshall, one of the top American military figures of the 20th century, had been so consistently involved in outcomes favorable to communism that malice or conspiracy must be assumed. Historians, biographers, and contemporaries universally rejected McCarthy's claims as false. Marshall's service record, from coordinating wartime strategy to formulating the Marshall Plan, stood in direct opposition to the idea that he had ever assisted communist interests. Truman regarded the attacks as hateful slander. He defended Marshall publicly and privately, calling him one of the greatest men to ever serve this country. Eisenhower had even more personal reasons to resent the accusations. His entire wartime career, from his promotion to brigadier general in 1941 to his appointment as supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, had been made possible by Marshall's decisions. Eisenhower acknowledged repeatedly in wartime correspondence that Marshall had been his champion. Thus, when McCarthy turned Marshall into a symbol of alleged communist infiltration, he was attacking one of the most respected figures in the military and one of the most important people in Eisenhower's own life. This set the stage for one of the most consequential political decisions Eisenhower would make in 1952.
The Transition Meeting, November 18, 1952. Following his decisive victory in the general election, 442 electoral votes to Stevenson's 89, Eisenhower traveled to Washington for the traditional transition meeting with the outgoing president. The meeting was held on November 18, 1952, in the Cabinet Room of the White House. From historical accounts, Eisenhower's notes, Truman's diary, and testimony from aides, the meeting was notably tense. Eisenhower responded minimally to Truman's briefings on national security and budget matters. Truman later wrote that Eisenhower did not want to hear anything. Eisenhower later wrote that the meeting added little to what I already knew. No friendly gestures were exchanged. Truman's attempts to establish rapport reportedly failed. Eisenhower's advisors believed Truman would try to manipulate him. Truman believed Eisenhower was deliberately creating distance. The meeting ended after less than 2 hours. This was the last substantive interaction between the two men until Inauguration Day. Pre-inaugural snubs and protocol issues. By December 1952, Truman's staff reached out to arrange the traditional pre-Christmas luncheon for the incoming president. Eisenhower did not attend and did not respond personally. Then, an additional small yet symbolic break occurred over inaugural attire. Truman learned from journalists that Eisenhower intended to wear a Homburg hat instead of the traditional silk top hat used by presidents during inaugurations.
This was not a major scandal, but for Truman, who valued traditions, it was an additional sign that Eisenhower did not respect established protocol or courtesy. Minor issues accumulated into major resentments. January 20th, 1953, the inauguration morning. Historical accounts from the Secret Service, White House staff, especially J.B. West, reporters on the lawn, and Truman's own memoirs reconstruct the scene. The Eisenhower limousine arrived at 8:45 a.m. The Trumans waited inside the White House, expecting the Eisenhowers to enter for the traditional coffee. The Eisenhowers remained in their car. White House staff were unsure whether to approach the vehicle. After several minutes, Truman exited the White House and entered the limousine himself. No contemporary records indicate any explanation from Eisenhower for declining to enter. The ride to the Capitol was described by multiple witnesses as silent or strained. Upon arrival, the two couples separated and proceeded with the standard inaugural procedures. Truman left Washington immediately after the ceremony and traveled by train back to Independence, Missouri.
The 8 years silence. During the Eisenhower presidency, 1953 to 1961, the two men had no private conversations. Eisenhower did not invite Truman back to the White House for any official events. Truman later claimed he had not received invitations. Eisenhower advisors later confirmed that at least 2 formal invitations were sent for major national ceremonies. Both declined. The only times they were physically in the same place were October 1959, funeral of George Marshall; November 1961, funeral of Speaker Sam Rayburn; November 1963, funeral of President John F. Kennedy. At all of these events, interactions were minimal or non-existent. The long silence between Truman and Eisenhower remains one of the most unusual and protracted estrangements between two presidents in American history. If you'd like to support the work we do here, consider subscribing and enabling notifications. Before we end, we'd like to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from. Viewers follow this channel from across the world, and each location adds to the record we preserve together. Share your city or state in the comments, and mention if anyone in your family served during the war. Thank you for watching.